She laughed in court when the judge described how her recklessness nearly killed a child. What followed was a stunning verdict that nobody, especially not her, would ever forget. The worn wooden bench was digging into my back, a dull ache that perfectly matched the anxiety churning in my stomach. Providence Traffic Court isn't exactly the Palace of Versailles, but on a Tuesday morning it feels like the most important room in the world. The air hung thick with the smell of old paper, stale coffee, and collective regret. My own sin? A 45 in a 35 zone, a simple mistake on my way to work. But as I watched person after person approach the bench to face Judge Marion, my simple mistake felt like a capital offense. Judge Marion was a local legend, not because he was a fire and brimstone type, but for the opposite reason. He was patient, kind, and had a way of speaking to people that was both disarming and deeply profound. He listened. Really listened. I saw him reduce a fine for a single mother who was choosing between paying the ticket and buying groceries, and I saw him give a stern but fair lecture to a young man who thought street racing was a video game. He was the embodiment of justice with a human heart. Then she walked in. The heavy oak doors swung open, and the quiet murmur of the courtroom was sliced in half by the sharp click, clack, click of 4-inch heels on the linoleum floor. Every head turned. She wasn't just dressed nicely. She was a walking billboard for designer brands. A crisp white blazer that probably cost more than my rent, sunglasses perched on her perfectly highlighted hair like a tiara, and a leather handbag tucked under her arm. She didn't look for a seat like the rest of us peasants. She surveyed the room as if she were deciding which piece of furniture to buy. A low whisper rippled through the benches. "That's Madison Sinclair, Councilman Sinclair's daughter." Of course it was. It explained the air of untouchable arrogance that radiated from her like heat. She found an empty spot at the end of a bench, sat down, and immediately pulled out her phone, the rapid tap, tap, tap of her acrylic nails creating an irritating new rhythm in the room's tense quiet. She wasn't nervous. She was annoyed. This was an inconvenience, a bothersome errand interrupting her day of, I assumed, spending her father's money. My own case was called. I stood before Judge Marion, my hands sweating. I explained my situation honestly. I was running late. I wasn't paying attention. It was my fault. He listened, nodded, looked at my clean record, and reduced the fine with a simple request. "Just be more mindful, son. The roads are shared spaces." I thanked him profusely, my body flooded with relief, and went back to my seat to wait for the paperwork. Now, I was just a spectator. Finally, the bailiff called her name. Madison Sinclair. She sighed a theatrical puff of air, slid her phone into her purse, and sauntered up to the defendant's table. She didn't stand with the humble, slightly stooped posture of everyone else. She leaned one hip out, resting a hand on the table as if she were ordering a latte. "Miss Sinclair," Judge Marion began, his voice as calm as ever, "you're here for a few violations. Reckless driving, failure to yield, and doing 55 miles per hour in a 25-mile-per-hour school zone." A wave of shock went through the courtroom. This wasn't a simple speeding ticket. This was a flagrant disregard for human life. The officer's report states you wove through traffic, cut off a minivan, and sped past Elm Street Elementary while the warning lights were flashing, the judge continued, peering over his glasses. "We also have a written statement from a witness, a Mrs. Gable, whose child was waiting at the crosswalk. Is there anything you'd like to say to this?" Madison flicked a piece of hair over her shoulder. "There was barely anyone around. It's being blown way out of proportion. My father, Councilman Sinclair, can attest to my character." She said his name like it was a get-out-of-jail-free card. Judge Marion's expression didn't change. He picked up a piece of paper. "I'd like to read a portion of Mrs. Gable's statement. The silver convertible came out of nowhere. I had to physically yank my 7-year-old son, Leo, back onto the curb. If I had been a second slower, he would have been hit. The driver never even slowed down." The judge paused, letting the weight of those words settle in the room. You could hear a pin drop. The air crackled with a kind of sacred horror. We were all imagining the same thing. A small child, a speeding car, a mother's terror. We were all holding our breath, all of us, except for one person. From the defendant's table came a small, sharp sound. It was a scoff, a little puff of air forced through pursed lips, followed by a quiet, dismissive chuckle. Madison Sinclair, daughter of the councilman, was laughing. She laughed at the thought of a mother pulling her child from the path of her speeding car. The sound, though quiet, echoed through the silent courtroom like a gunshot. Every eye, including mine, shot from her smirking face to the man on the bench. Judge Marion slowly put down the witness statement. He folded his hands, his kind, patient eyes hardening into something else entirely. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 20 degrees. The silence that followed her laugh was absolute. It was a heavy, suffocating silence, the kind that presses in on your ears. It wasn't just the absence of sound. It was the presence of a collective, unified shock. I'd seen people call him Judge Marion, a softer, friendlier name that suited his usual disposition. But the bronze nameplate on his bench read J. Caprio, and in that moment, as his jaw set and his eyes became like chips of granite, he was all Judge Caprio. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't bang his gavel. He simply stared at Madison Sinclair, his gaze so focused and intense it felt like a physical force. For a long, excruciating 10 seconds, the only movement in the room was the slow tick of the clock on the wall. Madison's smirk began to falter, twitching at the corners. The amusement in her eyes curdled into confusion. She wasn't being scolded, she was being dissected. "Miss Sinclair," Judge Caprio finally spoke, and his voice was a revelation. The warmth was gone, replaced by a low, cold precision that cut through the silence like a scalpel. "In the 10 years I have presided over this court, I have heard every excuse. I've heard tales of broken speedometers, medical emergencies, family tragedies, and alien abductions. I have seen tears of genuine remorse and tears of theatrical panic. But in all that time," he leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping even lower, "I have never, ever witnessed a defendant laugh at the near death of a child." Madison's face paled. The entitled lean was gone. She was standing straight now, her hands gripping the edge of the defendant's table. I didn't... It wasn't funny, I just..." she stammered, her composure shattering like cheap glass. "Then I must be mistaken," Judge Caprio said, his tone dripping with ice. "Perhaps you can enlighten the court. What precisely was the source of your amusement? Was it the part where a 7-year-old boy, named Leo, almost had his life extinguished because you were in a hurry? Or was it the image of his mother, Mrs. Gable, experiencing a terror that will likely stay with her for the rest of her life? Please clarify for us. We seem to have missed the punchline." Silence again. Madison opened her mouth, then closed it. The only sound was her own ragged breathing. She looked helplessly around the room, as if searching for an ally. But all she found were the cold, judging eyes of every person on the benches. She had been the star of her own show, and now she was the villain in everyone else's. "You mentioned your father," Judge Caprio continued, picking up another piece of paper without looking at it. "Councilman Sinclair. A man who, I believe, ran on a platform of community safety. A man who championed the very school zone you treated like a personal racetrack." He set the paper down. "Let me be unequivocally clear, Miss Sinclair. In this room, that name means nothing. It is not a shield. It is not a password. Here, you're not a councilman's daughter. You are a citizen who drove a 2-ton metal projectile at 55 miles per hour past a group of elementary school children. Nothing more, nothing less." He let that sink in, his gaze unwavering. He was methodically stripping away her privilege, layer by layer, until all that was left was the ugly truth of her actions. I saw a flicker of genuine fear in her eyes for the first time. This wasn't going away with a fine and a slap on the wrist. She had miscalculated on a colossal scale. Judge Caprio looked down at the witness statement again, then back at her. "Words on a page can be clinical," he said, his voice softening just a fraction, but it wasn't a comforting softness. It was the kind of quiet that precedes a storm. It's easy to dismiss them, to scoff at them. Sometimes we need a more tangible reminder of our actions. He looked past Madison, toward the bailiff standing stoically by the door. His next words landed like thunderclaps in the silent room. "Bailiff, Judge Caprio commanded, his voice clear and firm. "Is Mrs. Gable still in the witness waiting room?" The bailiff nodded. "Yes, Your Honor." "Good," the judge said, his eyes locking back onto Madison Sinclair's terrified face. "Please bring her in, and bring her son, Leo, as well." The entire courtroom held its breath. It was one thing to hear a name on a piece of paper, a clinical, detached account of a near tragedy. It was another thing entirely to bring the human elements of that story into the room. This wasn't just a sentencing anymore, it was a reckoning. Madison Sinclair's face, which had cycled through arrogance, confusion, and fear, now settled on a mask of pure, white-hot panic. She looked like a cornered animal. Her eyes darted toward the heavy oak doors as if contemplating a desperate escape. The bailiff returned a moment later, holding the door open. A woman entered first, her shoulders tense, her face etched with a lingering anxiety that hadn't faded in the days since the incident. This had to be Mrs. Gable. She clutched the hand of a small boy, who peeked out from behind her legs with wide, curious eyes. He had a mop of sandy brown hair and was wearing a T-shirt with a cartoon dinosaur on it. This was Leo. He wasn't an abstract concept in a police report anymore. He was a small flesh-and-blood boy who liked dinosaurs and who had almost ceased to exist because a spoiled woman in a convertible was impatient. The sight of them sent a fresh wave of condemnation through the benches. Low murmurs erupted, shushed quickly by the bailiff's stern glare. Mrs. Gable guided her son to the front row, taking a seat directly in Madison's line of sight. Leo, seemingly unaware of the gravity of the situation, swung his legs back and forth, his sneakers thumping softly against the wood of the bench. Each little thump was an indictment. Judge Caprio allowed the scene to marinate for a full minute. He wanted Madison to look. He wanted her to see the face of the child whose life she had valued at less than a few minutes of her time. Madison, to her credit or her shame, couldn't. Her gaze was fixed firmly on the polished floor, her designer sunglasses now seeming like a pathetic attempt to hide from the reality she had created. "Mrs. Gable," Judge Caprio said, his voice now gentle, the coldness reserved solely for the defendant. "Thank you for coming in. I know this isn't easy." The woman nodded, her hand protectively on Leo's shoulder. "He wouldn't let me leave him with a sitter, Your Honor. He's been jumpy, afraid of cars." The judge's eyes flickered to Madison. "I see." He then addressed the boy directly, his tone kind and paternal. "Leo, can you look at me for a second?" The little boy shyly peered over the back of the bench. "I have a very important question for you," Judge Caprio said, leaning forward. "What do you want to be when you grow up?" Leo chewed on his lip for a moment, then whispered, "A firefighter." "A firefighter," the judge exclaimed with a small, genuine smile. "That is a wonderful thing to be. A hero. You know, you'll get to help a lot of people." He paused, letting his smile fade as he turned his piercing gaze back to the defendant. "Miss Sinclair, Leo wants to be a firefighter. He wants to grow up and save lives, a future you almost erased from existence. For what? To get to a lunch appointment a few minutes earlier?" Madison flinched as if he had physically struck her. She finally looked up, her eyes swimming with tears. They weren't the tears of remorse I'd seen earlier. They were the tears of someone whose perfect world had just been torched to the ground. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice cracking. I'm so sorry." "You are not sorry," Judge Caprio countered instantly, his voice sharp again. "You are sorry you got caught. You are sorry you have to face this woman and her child. You are sorry that for the first time in your life, your father's name is not enough to make a problem disappear. Your laughter, a few minutes ago, told this court everything it needs to know about your true capacity for remorse." He stood up, a rare move that signaled the finality of his decision. He paced slowly behind his bench, his black robe flowing behind him. The entire room was his stage, and we were all hanging on his next word. "Fines are meaningless to you," he said, thinking aloud. "Your father would pay it before you even left the courthouse, suspending your license. You'd likely drive anyway, confident you wouldn't be caught. No, a punishment, for it to be just, must be instructive. It must be memorable." He stopped pacing and stood directly behind his high-backed chair, his hands resting on it. He looked from Madison to Mrs. Gable and finally to little Leo, who was now looking at the judge with a kind of childish awe. "Therefore, I am not fining you a single dollar," Judge Caprio declared. A gasp went through the courtroom. Madison looked up, a flicker of hope, of disbelief in her tear-filled eyes. Had she gotten off? Had his whole speech been just a performance? The absurdity of it was baffling. No fine? For nearly killing a child? The room buzzed with confusion and a rising sense of injustice. I felt my own fists clench. Was this it? Was this how it worked for the rich and powerful, after all? The judge was going to let her walk. The flicker of hope in Madison's eyes was extinguished as quickly as it had appeared. Judge Caprio wasn't finished. He held up a hand to quell the rising murmur in the courtroom, his expression severe. "Do not misunderstand me," he said, his voice ringing with authority. "You will not be paying the court. You will be paying for your education." He moved back to the center of the bench and sat down, his gaze fixed on the utterly bewildered Madison Sinclair. "For the next 30 days," he began, enunciating each word with deliberate care, "from 8 a.m. to 9 a.m. and again from 3 p.m. to 4 p.m., you will report to Elm Street Elementary. You will be given a reflective vest and a stop sign. You, Miss Sinclair, are going to be a crossing guard." The silence in the room was broken by a collective, audible gasp. My own jaw went slack. It was brilliant. It was poetic. It was a punishment that fit the crime so perfectly it was almost a work of art. Madison stared at him, her mouth opening and closing like a fish, but no sound came out. "Every school day," the judge continued, an ironclad finality in his tone, "you will stand on that same corner where you nearly committed vehicular manslaughter. You will be responsible for ensuring that every child, including Leo, gets across the street safely. You will look every one of them in the eye. You will look their parents in the eye. You will feel the cold, the rain, and the impatience of the drivers just like you, who are in a hurry. You will learn, in the most tangible way possible, what it means to be responsible for the safety of a community." He wasn't done. "Furthermore, your convertible is to be impounded for the duration of this sentence. You will find your own way to and from the school. I suggest the bus. It will be an illuminating experience. If you are late by even 1 minute, or if you miss a single day without a doctor's note that I myself will personally verify, you will spend the remainder of those 30 days in the adult correctional institution. No exceptions, no excuses, and absolutely no help from your father." He pointed his pen at her. "Am I making myself clear?" Madison could only nod, tears now streaming freely down her face, stripping away her carefully applied makeup. These weren't the tears of a cornered socialite anymore. They were the tears of someone who had just been handed a life sentence, albeit a 30-day one. A sentence to be served not in a cell, but in the crucible of public humility and forced empathy. "One more thing," Judge Caprio said, his voice softening once more as he turned to Mrs. Gable and her son. "Leo, when you grow up and become a firefighter, you will save people. You will be a hero. What this woman did was the opposite of that. But perhaps," he looked back at Madison, "by watching you and your friends cross the street safely every day, she will learn a small fraction of what it means to value a human life. That is my hope." He banged the gavel once, the sound echoing with profound finality. "Court is adjourned." As the room began to stir and people filed out, I stayed in my seat, watching the scene unfold. Mrs. Gable hugged her son tightly, whispering something in his ear. Madison stood frozen, her shoulders slumped in utter defeat, until the bailiff gently guided her toward a clerk to receive her official instructions. She looked smaller, stripped of her designer armor, just a young woman facing the real-world consequences of her actions for the very first time. I left the courthouse and walked out into the bright Providence sunshine. The world felt a little more just than it had an hour ago. For the next month, on my way to work, I made a point of driving down Elm Street, and every morning I saw her. Madison Sinclair, her expensive hair pulled back in a messy ponytail, her face devoid of makeup, stood on that corner wearing an oversized fluorescent yellow vest. She held the red stop sign with a rigid seriousness I never would have thought her capable of. She didn't look arrogant or annoyed. She looked humbled. She looked focused. On the last Friday of her sentence, I saw something that stuck with me. A light rain was falling. As a group of kids crossed, little Leo, holding his mother's hand, turned back to Madison. He held up his other hand and gave her a small, shy wave. After a moment's hesitation, Madison Sinclair, the councilman's daughter, raised her own hand and waved back. There was no laughter, no smirk. Just a quiet, shared moment of humanity on a rainy street corner. And in that moment, I knew Judge Caprio hadn't just silenced the court. He had delivered a verdict that might have actually saved a soul.